it's always rewarding and interesting to find young people, students, being fascinated by the same kind of stuff that you have been fascinated by throughout your life. So thanks again for this opportunity to share some thoughts on social cognition and collective intentionality. And if the words don't mean yet a lot to you, they hopefully will soon.
But the subtitle is the linguistic perspective, so there is some interesting stuff of a very general nature about what it is that makes us human. But I think that linguistics, a linguist has, from its specific knowledge and background, some specific contributions to make about those, about the connections between cognition and intentionality. So, from an evolutionary perspective, it is quite clear that the language and social cognition, the study of those, are closely interconnected. Language has all kinds of properties that can only exist in certain, and can only be explained in terms of certain aspects of humans being a social species with a particular kind of cognitive infrastructure, as Mike Tomasello calls it, that allows this degree of sociality. So the two are highly interconnected, and will be addressing a specific idea about some of the especially chronological aspects of those interconnections in our evolutionary history that have been proposed by Michael Tomasello in his most recent work. He's been doing a lot of publications, a lot of work about that issue throughout his career, but in his most recent work, this is 2016, A Natural History of Human Morality, but the general idea is also present in actually pretty much the same form in his 2014 A Natural History of Human Thinking. Quite a bit of it is also in some advanced form, in fact, already present in his 2008 Origins of Human Communication, in which he summarizes quite a lot of his work throughout his career, especially in his period as director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. So these properties that make these interconnections so important are that languages have, biologically speaking, some funny properties. They are energetic. It's an energetically cheap kind of communication. Always like to include the little anecdote, a little piece of fact is that the total amount of acoustic energy that a person produces in a human lifetime, if he would be speaking 24 hours a day, would not suffice to boil the water of one cup of tea. So it's energetically extremely cheap. But on the other hand, at the same time, reliable. And the reliable communication systems in the biological world are mostly not energetically cheap in order to be reliable. So that's a funny aspect. And something that is actually related to that, is that languages are fundamentally governed by conventions. So the rules for which sound have which meanings are determined by conventions in a particular community, leading to the fact, as Tomasello notices at the beginning of the Origins of Human Communication, that the human species is exceptional in the animal kingdom, also in the respect that its basic communication system doesn't allow it to communicate with any other member of the species. It only allows it to communicate with the people who belong to the same group of sharing the conventions for that particular language. And conventionality has the property of being describable as a motivation for people to behave in a particular kind of way. It has a normative character. We do things in a particular way, attach this kind of meaning to that sound, because other people are doing it in that way, and we know that they expect us to do it in that way, and therefore we do it. So this has this this property of conventionality, of conventions, is predicated upon a very basic property of willingness to cooperate, to do what others want us to do, and to expect others to do the same to us. So there is a basic cooperative attitude underlying this crucial aspect of language. So that's to give you an idea of how closely connected and why so closely connected general issues of what makes us human are to properties of specific design features, as Hockert calls them, of languages. So you don't need a personal experience of willingness of the other to cooperate with you, providing the basis for your willingness to cooperate with them. Simply belonging to the same group, speaking the same language, allows you to enter, and you in fact do, into all kinds of common projects with these other individuals, with your whole group. You have internalized norms, not only the norms of your language, but the norms of your institutions. And language, in a way, can be characterized as a kind of institution in and of itself. So that is at the very last stage. Modern human life is characterized by this group-level, normatively governed intentionality, relation to the outside world. And that is the present, the most important and characteristic and distinctive as compared to other social beings on the planet, characteristics of humans. But that has been preceded and has been made possible, in his view, by a preceding stage that he calls not collective intentionality, but joint intentionality. And joint intentionality is basically the idea that you, on an individual basis, collaborate with cooperative partners in a joint project to catch a particular kind of prey, grow a particular kind of crop, do some specific project that is both in your and your partner's mutual interest, and kind of mutualistic tit for tat reciprocity. There is altruism, there are expectations, there is a communication, there are developed signaling systems in order to allow that collaboration to continue, but it's all on an ad hoc individual, one individual collaborating with another kind of basis. And the argument for that order is a kind of logical argument in that work, and I've quoted it here. It has a relationship with ontogeny, and a lot of Tomasello's work is about child development, as you may know if you're familiar with his work. But let me just mention here that the most important logical point there. Why is it the case that joint intentionality must have preceded a collective intentionality and given rise to it? It is supported by the fact that ontogeny shows this order, according to Tomasello, but I'll get back to that. But it's also partly logical, as he says. One must have some skills for coordinating with other individuals before coordinating with the group. And so then the ontogenetic ordering is basically the same as a hypothesized phylogenetic ordering. And I want to suggest that although this may seem plausible, because it seems unavoidable to say, okay, you need some coordination possibilities to be at all capable of doing this large-scale group-level coordination, collaboration. It is nevertheless not really a completely valid argument. It's not a necessity. And there are reasons, partly from linguistics, to suggest a different story. The different story is inspired by the existence, as a matter of fact, of an alternative scenario in the scientific research, in the literature. And I'm especially want to put forward the so-called cultural group selection theory originally proposed already in the latter part of the 20th century by Boyd and Richardson. And the basic idea is sketched out here, that natural selection in certain conditions, in certain ecological conditions, can favor certain groups of initially somewhat loosely collaborating, loosely trusting individuals as groups for their survival. So if that persistence, if that is the case, in certain ecological conditions, then that can create the conditions within that group for individuals to evolve gradually over the generations, higher level of trust within that group, because they help the whole group to survive and to outcompete other groups. And when that happens, so the driving force is actually happening at the group level, the selectional forces are actually operative at the group level, then it makes sense for these individuals, for the behavior that is evolving under the pressure of group selection, to also use that for smaller scale projects than the group enterprises, the survival of the tribe, so to speak. So in other words, putting it in our case, turning it to our case, things like collective intentionality and the tools that are, and the patterns of behavior that evolve in individuals under selective pressure that works at the group level will naturally, since they are then be available to the individual members, also be used by in smaller scale projects. So turning the order around. And this could be an instance, it actually ties in quite naturally, I think, this whole approach with a view on so-called major transitions in evolution proposed in 1995 by Maynard Smith and Sathmari as a kind of general pattern in the evolution of life on the planet. Sharing a certain common logic, and I'll get back to that, I'll characterize that in a minute, where each time what they call a major transition is that some of the causal factors that cause selection to happen are shifting from a level of individuals, some individuals that originally are reproducing and competing, shifting to a group level, and after which the survival of the individual is completely dependent on the survival of the whole group. The transition from single-cell organisms to multicellular organisms is the first big important case. There must have been some pretty special conditions in certain areas where it was advantageous for individual cells to distribute certain aspects of labor of living in the world over different members in particular ways, and started to do things together, I would say anthropomorphically speaking. And if that kind of situations persist for a really long time, then there is no turning back for these individual cells making up a multicellular organisms to survive on their own. They can only survive together with the other cells in a multicellular organism. So they are no longer capable individually to interact with the environment and survive. That has shifted to the group level. The same logic applies to the phenomenon of social insects. a puzzle that has something that has already puzzled Darwin. Why are individual bees sacrificing their capabilities of reproduction for the whole hive? It doesn't seem to make sense, but this can only be understood in this evolutionary story that certain conditions were such that they pressed individuals to collaborate with others, and when these conditions persisted for a long enough period, there was no turning back. So some of the fitness-relevant variation shifts from individuals to population-level phenomena. That is the general pattern. When that happens, then these authors speak of a major transitions. And they include human beings in their whole story. The formation of human societies, groups of people living together, are an instance of such a transition that shares the same logic. They have this chapter on the origin of societies. As a matter of fact, they also have a chapter on the origin of language. The general idea is completely on the right track, I think, but much of the details, many of the details in there are no longer really valid because we have learned it, especially about the evolution of language, a lot in the meantime, summarized nicely in this book from 2014, I think, by James Herford. Anyway, the common logic, I've already sort of glossed over that. The very basics of it is organisms can find each other closely together, form kind of groups for many, many different reasons, totally independently. For ecological reasons, they are closer together than widely distributed all over the place. And in certain conditions, the advantages of doing things together can be bigger than the advantages of competition. It's not frequent, it's relatively rare kind of situation, but it does happen, and when it happens, it creates such a transition that there is no turning back. In the case of humans, when we take humans to be an instance of this kind of major transition whereby the part of the selective pressure, part of the fitness criteria have shifted from individual to group level, the mechanism that makes groups is not or only on a very small scale genetic, but largely culture. It is learned behavior that is transmitted from one generation to the next by learning, by imitation, which has had probably in our evolutionary past some advantages in rapidly changing and highly variable ecologies, because learned behavior can adapt faster to changing environments than genetically determined behavior. Now, this idea of the alternative scenario that I sketched, that group level selection, a shifting of selective pressure to the group level, may have created the conditions favoring cultural learning and group level cooperation. That has actually, is not only a logical possibility, but there is actually interesting empirical support in the case of primates. And I'm referring here to a study that was published in Nature in 2011, where the investigators, Schultz et al., examined the distribution of social patterns of social behavior, ways of social living, over the phylogenetic tree of primates. So the phylogenetic trees of primates is determined on the basis of similarity and dissimilarity of DNA. So it is a genetic-based tree of the family tree of the primates, and they mapped that onto the different patterns of sociality that each group of primates, each species of primates exhibits. Now, initially, following purely an argument like Tomasello was doing from increasing complexity, what are the logical conditions necessary, logically speaking, for some level of cooperation, you might think, well, this is the increasing complexity, and forget about this one for a moment. From solitary living, where each individual is living on its own and in principle competing with the others, to living in small related groups, pairs and family groups, kin, ultimately to groups of many males and many females together. But what they did is say, well, let's in principle allow any kind of transition, because we can imagine mechanisms of that would allow that, despite the logical, apparent logical scale of complexity, and see what the facts of the phylogenetic relatedness tells us about the most likely patterns giving the distribution of DNA. And it turns out that there is very strong evidence altogether that this is the most likely pattern of the evolution of social systems among primates, starting indeed with solitary living, usually going to group living with several males and females, which gave rise in some families, in some species of primates, to a dominant way of living in family groups, and also from this sometimes going back and forth to situations in which the females live in groups and the males live solitarily, and sometimes go in and out of the groups. The one that is important for me is precisely this finding, which is exactly in line with the general idea of the cultural group selection phenomenon that was proposed, process that was proposed by Boyd and Richardson. So I hope now to have at least prepared your minds for the possibility that for this alternative scenario, that it should be taken seriously, as a serious alternative to just the logic and ontogenetic arguments that Tomasello was presenting, as to suggest that to make it a kind of obvious that it must have gone in these two stages. And what I now want to add is especially the linguistic, some perspectives on linguistic, from the linguistic perspective. And I'll briefly look at the first two points are things that I want to look at briefly: ontogeny and nature of argumentative discourse, population dynamics, and its consequences for communication systems, and most extensively spend most time on recursive mind reading. So first, the argument from ontogeny. Tomasello represents the, you'll remember that he was presenting this as ontogeny shows this development from joint intentionality to collective intentionality, and that reflects the logic and also the hypothesized phylogenetic ordering of processes. And he describes the ontogenetic situation like this. Until around their third birthday, young children's social interactions are basically second personal. They do not fully understand how such things as language, artifacts, and social norms work. But around 3 years of age, they begin to actively enforce norms on others. So then there is evidence that they have discovered the special character of group-level phenomena like conventions and norms, and understand that some pieces of language are conventional only in some subgroups, like proper names that are only known within the group of family members and not necessarily outside of them. So then they have discovered we intentionality, collective intentionality, as it were. But there is an alternative interpretation of the same situation, namely that before their third birthday, or a bit in the way of the terms that Tomasello is himself using, simply children do not make the distinction. We might also say children, and there is actually a lot, I think, to say for that position just as well. But here I'm only involved with concerned with the fact that this is just as much a description of what's going on as Tomasello's. Young children do not distinguish between the two ways, the second personal dual level and collective, because they live in the dream world, as it were, characterizable by the idea that everything is transparent information for everybody. Everybody knows what my name is, and of course this is Granny, and everybody knows that this is Granny, and that by finding out that that doesn't always work, they gradually learn to make the distinction between the two. So they start out with a kind of collective intentionality assumption, as it were, and learn to make the distinction between smaller and larger groups gradually along the way. Now, from a linguistic point of view, there are some aspects, properties of language that Tomasello pays a little bit of attention to that suggest that precisely this must also be on the right track. Tomasello states quite explicitly that what he calls argumentative discourse, so that is closely related to explicit reasoning about possible states of affairs involving conditionals, negation, and that sort of thing, is a component, belongs to the stage of public discourse. Now, I agree that is, content-wise, that it belongs to this domain of public discourse where you're trying to convince an audience, for example, in the Athenian market square, of what the right way to proceed is, go to war or not go to war, and that sort of thing. It's this public group level domain, but in his story that has to be second stage, so pretty recent. But argumentative language with conditionals and all connectives and disjunctions, negation, is part and parcel of dual level collaboration as well. If you look at any transcripts that you can find in conversation analysis publications, there are loads and loads of things. This is just a very brief example from one of Clark's things with argumentative linguistic elements underlined. Modals, negation, conclusion elements like so, because, modals like probably, disjunction, or you name it. It's everywhere. Negation, in particular, is one of the first kind of things that is acquired by children in its basic function of denying the position of someone else and or rejecting it about 2 years of age. So argumentation, from that point of view, also looking ontogenetically, should be part of the basics of the story of basics of human communication. It's there very early, but at the same time, it is part of this public discourse. So this public discourse aspect should probably be not a very recent stage, but an earlier, should represent an earlier stage. And I take it as a kind of support for the idea that I presented you at the beginning, namely that individuals use the tools that have developed in a community, including linguistic tools, also for lower scale projects. The stories that Tomasello, the scenarios that Tomasello develops for different levels of syntactic complexity, the informing and sharing motives of communication, do not have a place for this kind of argumentative discourse. Nevertheless, it seems to be really basic, so it has to be included in the story, and I think it can be included, still recognizing its belonging to the public domain. If we give the public domain a more prominent and earlier position in human history than he does. A brief point about population dynamics and its consequences for communication. The two-stage story from joint intentionality to collective intentionality implies that a kind of scaling up from this small-scale, mutualistic, reciprocal altruism to cultural altruism and recognition. And he formulates that quite explicitly here at the end of this quote: the next leap forward from the specific occasions that belong to the stage of joint intentionality, the next leap will have to take this cooperativist cognition and thinking and collectivize it by conventionalizing and institutionalizing. So creating, among other things, language in its modern sense with all its institutional character. Now, when you try to model this idea, you run into a problem. The problem is basically this, that when we take communicative practices that people that work together, two people working together, we all have, I think, this experience a little bit. They do develop routines for doing things and communicating. They're kind of signaling systems on a one-by-one basis. But if there is not a lot of communication, if most of communication and collaboration is limited to these dyads, each dyad works out its own small signaling system, very strongly based on shared personal experiences and with very little overlap. And when we introduce these kinds of communication, these kinds of population communication, have a very limited communication. Communication is practically limited to individuals in a system where the signals are relatively alike. So we, by hypothesis, say, well, okay, let's start from the assumption that the signaling systems are largely alike, but we have actual communication taking place on these only on this dyad kind of way. What happens is that innovations that each dyad invents do not spread to the entire community. They remain, and everybody continuously, because of the variation in the environment and the variation in the tasks, develops innovations. And we can show by computationally modeling these kinds of things that every time and again, the coherence of such a community decreases. So it's actually quite hard, if not impossible, for this scaling up from dyadic communication to coherent group-level communication to evolve. If anything, it is the reverse that happens. And empirical evidence pointing in the same direction is the fact that really full-blown conventional systems of sign languages among deaf communities that we have historical records of, even recently, like Nicaraguan Sign Language and Bedouin Sign Language, they only evolve in relatively large communities with a lot of communication between everybody going on. At least 25 people have to be there. The dyads evolve only things that people call home sign and do not have the properties of full-blown languages. You need to have a public communication system. Okay, final point from a linguistic perspective on recursion, and then a recursive mind reading in particular. Tomasello notes that for this joint intentionality phenomenon to work, people must be able to make recursive inferences about each other's mental states for this dyadic communication and collaboration to work. And that stage should precede the stage where we approach a kind of above individual level knowledge and reasoning, where we reason from general rules to specific instances and specific ways of action. And this recursivity is called that way, that making these recursive inference, it seems, for obvious reasons. If two individuals happen to be attending to be the same to the same object, but they don't know about each other that they are attending to the same object, that is not sufficient for collaboration with this particular with respect to this particular object to occur. It's just a coincidence they happen to be attending to the same object. What we need in order for collaboration to get going is that one also knows that the other is attending to this object, and this one, B, knows that A is attending to that object. However, it could this picture represents a situation that also is valid for saying this person can know that this person is the object that he is attending to, but this one doesn't have to know that this one knows this as well. So we have to add another piece of knowledge about the other's mental states, about the mental states of the other, and you can fill in the rest of the story yourself. In principle, you would need to have this go on indefinitely. Now, that's not something that people can do in practice, in real time, because then we would never get to do any action. If we have to do represent we intentionality, and I derive inspiration especially from Herb Clark, but also from John Searle's ideas of where the term we, he invented the term, I think he coined the term we intentionality for this situation, where we consider at least a pair, but we can also, for the sake of the argument, also talk about a group of individuals as a unit, as a cognitive unit that is jointly attending to a particular object, rather than a purely one individual A who has all kinds of mental states about the other, and B having all kinds of mental states about A. These mental states of individuals can be, if need be, if necessary, derived from this kind of situation. If you remember a previous interaction where you jointly did something as a team with respect to an object of attention, and you reflect on it, then you can come to the conclusion that what we were doing together is something that you were also individually doing. So these kind of ultimately recursively possible inferences can be derived from that, but you don't start from it. Marcello makes the point that this kind of we intentionality cannot have evolved in one step, but I don't think that in itself is a strong argument, because all this complex stuff of much mutually dependent cooperation, linguistic conventions, culture in general, has not evolved in one step either. So that's not a very strong point. Now, from a linguistic perspective in particular, how is this recursive mind reading reflected in languages and supported by language? We have a lot of evidence to suggest that recursivity is secondary and not primary. We don't start there, but it is something that becomes a possibility, of an inferential possibility, supported by underlying linguistic tools. So let's start with this kind of thing that is common in psychological studies on so-called theory of mind, what people know about what is in other people's minds. And it's absolutely true that normally developed humans, adults, understand easily what people call second-order intentionality. So, exemplified by this sentence such as, Ted knows that Sarah knows that the apple is red. So, we know something about what another person knows about the world. But we can also understand that in other ways. This linguistic construction of sentences embedded in sentences is not the only way in which we can understand such situations. So a comic strip like this does the same thing. By the way, this is this is developed in much detail by my student Max van Duin, who last year, 2016, published his PhD on this. That's what actually this whole story is based on. So there are different kinds of, several ways, different types of representation supporting something that can be characterized as second-order intentionality. But when we look further, then the differences in representation start to make a difference. If we take Shakespeare's Othello and try to characterize the situation, what people know about the situation and what you know about each of the characters and what they know about each other, then it would have to be this kind of cascade of things, and nobody can really process that. It doesn't work like that. But the text, reading the text is not the problem. You understand it definitely in that way. Seeing the play being performed helps you understand this situation, but you can't represent it in this kind of particular way. What exactly it is? That's an interesting issue that makes especially texts, narratives, and dramas work in that way. I'll have to refer you to the work by Max van Duin for that, but this is just the important point to be made here, that these texts and plays that do not themselves have these orders of intentionality, of embedding. It's not plays embedded in plays of the same structure that makes this work. One thing that I want to draw your attention to, in particular, that doesn't only suggest that this is difficult, but somehow on the wrong track, and gives you an idea of the problem that has to be solved, is that it doesn't at all capture the fact that in watching a play, reading a narrative, the readership, the audience, is epistemically involved in assessing this most deeply embedded proposition, so to speak. We are, as readers and watchers, involved in assessing whether Cassio is serving the good cause or not. And we are assessing and tracking what all kinds of other minds, how they relate to that same proposition, what their epistemic relation to that same proposition is. This flat representation makes only Iago's belief, Iago's intentions to the object of the belief, and doesn't allow for a direct epistemic connection between the audience and Cassio serving the good cause. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, languages themselves, not only narrative and dramatic performances with their structure, with their particular structural properties, allow these complex mindscapes and thoughtscapes to be processed. Languages themselves have lots and lots of units that also provide support for this kind of inferential work that can be done online. A language, Australian language Dalabon, described by Nicholas Evans, for example, doesn't have at all a grammatical tool like subordination, the complementation that the English has know that. Examples demonstrate. But it does have things like an adverb, we would say, or a particle like this, that when attached to a particular clause gives a signal that this present speaker does not necessarily commit to the truth of that proposition, is not committed to the truth necessarily of that proposition, but nevertheless wants his audience to process it because it's relevant to the entire story that is being told. In general, listeners to stories and participants in communication infer from this that this must be relevant then, and must be believed by somebody else if it's not the speaker that is doing it. So it provides a basis for inferring other people's mental states from the fact that the speaker says that he is not 100% committed to a particular proposition. And actually, languages that closer to home, that we know better, have things that are not maybe as generally used as this Dalabon particle in the English language, but they're nevertheless present and processed, like supposedly German and Dutch certain German and Dutch modal constructions. Many languages have whole systems of evidentials that do similar kinds of things, and along the way allow listeners to make inferences about other people's mental states that they can reproduce. So many different kinds of viewpoint, and that's why I want to put in this plug here, viewpoint tools in different languages are themselves not direct representations and do not exhibit this property of recursivity, but nevertheless provide a basis for, in understanding a particular story, embed and increase the number of the representation of other people's mental states with respect to a particular proposition to the extent needed in that particular story. My own clock just told me that I still have some 5 minutes or so. Is that how am I doing for time?
Well, you have some 10 minutes
for the talk, and then we have still enough discussion time. Okay, in that case, it's nice to do a little bit of specific grammatical. After all, that is my basic professional business, grammar. The Russian apprehension construction, and you can tell me later if Czech has a similar construction or not at all, another Slavic language. This is a classic issue from Russian grammar. My Russian is really bad, so I'm not going to pronounce this. But there are two ways. It's apparent. It seems, from an English point of view, as it were, in which you can say in Russian that you're afraid that somebody may fall ill. And it's not entirely captured by the translation, but the crucial thing is that this is a что complementizer, and this is the falling ill in the future. And here we have another construction with a particle, a subjunctive marker, and a negative element, a negation in it. Как бы не. That is the characteristic stuff there. And the funny thing, again, funny from an English perspective, is this negation here, because the proper translation should not be I'm afraid that he may not fall ill, which you might be inclined as an English speaker to translate. The translation must be I'm afraid he may fall ill. Positive. From an English perspective. Now, this same thing, Cagbine, can do the same work, it seems, on its own. So without a matrix clause saying I'm afraid of something, I fear something, or something along those lines. It's still expressive. There might be a fire. I'm afraid there might be a fire. At first instance, you might think that this looks like a case of insubordination, the use of a subordinate clause independently, the independent use of a subordinate clause, what Nick Evans has coined insubordination. But when we look at the actual usage, and this is what Katja Bajdina did in her master's thesis, where I derived these data from, that you see that the actual majority of cases in actual usage is just this independent use, with this meaning of being afraid that something might happen, with a negation element in it. And quite a bit, making this majority even larger, is not a complement either, but would grammatically have a kind of adjunct status. So it is not the complement of a transitive predicate, but could be translated of something like fearing death in that situation. So what Bajdina concludes, this is an example of this in fear use of this construction, and another example. But what she concludes is, okay, that we have, in construction grammar terms, we have this construction that is associated with the conventionally in Russian with the expression of apprehension or fear of whatever is in this slot. And it can be, in another construction, combined with a fear predicate that is not subordinated to it, but might in English, and this is not fully idiomatic, conventionalized English, but we can nevertheless sort of assess its structure, its non-subordinated structure, can be glossed as, I am worried about something, please let this not happen. Including a negation also in this English kind of gloss. The difference being that this is not conventionalized in English, but conventionalized in Russian, but we can make sense of the underlying motivation either way. And of course, the crucial thing is that there is no subordination, so no grammatical basis for this recursivity that seemed to be an important aspect when we look at the English complementation constructions for expressing the relations between mental states. So, returning to the issue of, excuse me. What is it, or what is at least part of what makes it hard to get rid of this recursivity? Then we wanted to get back to this, what I drew your attention to when I had this flat structure of all these embeddings from Othello, in this characterization from Othello, and saying, what we should be doing is take into account that the logic, as it were, of thinking about other people's mental states and thinking about the world is not a one-dimensional or even a two-dimensional phenomenon, but a three-dimensional one in principle. Studies of communication take into account that there is always a sender and an addressee, a speaker and an addressee, and they are coordinating with respect to an object of conceptualization. But when other minds are also involved, these other minds are not thereby turned into objects of conceptualization. They form a separate dimension of conceptualization. They are not part of the speaker addressee in the communicative situation either. They are others, indeed, but are not reduced conceptually to objects of conceptualization. And that is the crucial point. If you recognize that, then we have this a 3D logic instead of a 2D logic. When only first persons are being expressed, as in the Russian apprehension construction, with only the CAK being the thing, and there are no other persons are being put on stage, are being represented in the story, then just like the English expression, I think, we have no subordination going on, but just an expression of the particular epistemic stance of one of the participants in the communicative situation. But third persons invoke this third dimension necessarily, but in such a three-dimensional representation, rather than a flat two-dimensional one, we can still account for the fact that the speaker and addressee are themselves also epistemically involved and keep epistemically interested in the same object of conceptualization. Languages differ in the kind of support that they provide and constraints that they provide on how to fill in, so to speak, the relationships between different conceptualizers in such a model. English complementation has related to so-called indirect speech, has certain properties peculiar to that construction. Conventionalized, something like he promised that he time can represent a situation in which he has uttered the word I promise, so also responsible for promise, or the promise is entirely the responsibility of the present speaker. He characterizes it as a promise. Those are not words used by the other character. You don't really know anything in between depending on the situation. The responsibility is sort of distributed. Same is true for non-communicative predicates of cognition, like think. Carla may have said, I think she is the mother, represented in indirect speech by Carla thinks that. Anyway, so this is a kind of distributed responsibility associated with this particular grammatical construction. But now I miss a, sorry. The kind of the Russian construction doesn't have that particular characteristic. Russian may, of course, I don't know enough about Russian complementation construction, also alongside the apprehension construction that is functionally similar to the English one. Anyway, coming towards the end, recursive mind reading is a secondary trait, is what this all is suggesting, supported by language, and in ontogeny by all kinds of other teaching predicates. Then through the time I skipped the reasons why I included this picture. I'm also going to skip over this question, but just mentioning the relevance, and that I recognize the need of this question. If we are to take this story, which is a more complex historical development than Tomasello, seriously, we have to come up with mechanisms that will allow and explain the transitions. So the transitions, I think they're there, but I'm not going to go over them, but conclude with this claim that I announced in the beginning, that properties of present-day language, it's being public, argumentative language being basic, support the idea of cultural evolution of languages in human populations at the group level that are then also naturally being employed for lower scale cooperation, joint projects between individuals that do not know each other personally. And with that, thank you for your attention. Any questions?
So yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I think we can start discussion. So we'll start. Please.
Thank you. I enjoyed that very much. And my name is Andrius Kulikauskas from Vilnius Gediminas Technical University in Lithuania.
We have met before.
Oh, good. And I just learned about Tomasello's work recently, but I was interested. I'll be talking about how I interpret it in terms of games, so that I'm saying that what the fundamental way that happens in humans is that we're able to make games, not just play. And so from an evolutionary point of view, when I think of what you're saying, I imagine that the primary way that we developed this we intentionality is, let's say, first of all, through our physical synchronicity. So I'll be showing pictures and stuff like that. The way we're seated with each other is very harmonious in a way. When I look at apes, I'm not an expert, but they don't seem to have that kind of group harmony in physical arrangement. And then if you have like a unison, if you build on this, like let's say through things like singing and things through dancing and drumming, which are very important for having the right motivation, you don't need to have any kind of recursive dyadic thinking. But I think what happens, and what I would, to build on what you say, for culture, when we have these kind of strong joint games and activities and obligations, etc., the idea of being an independent thinker, to say, I don't agree, I don't go along, and first you may have just a game of agreement, but you may end up saying a game of being a dissenter. You see, that I go along, but I think differently, right? That's a more advanced thing that for large cultures you need. It's not that you need more jointness, it means that you need more independent thinking. And then all the types of recursive, well, I know that you know that I know that you know, that seems to become relevant. Maybe just to say, the maximum of human intelligence that I'm aware of is the lost child, let's say in an airport. Like the dumb child will go looking for their parents. But the smart child knows that I'm the child, they're the parent, they're supposed to be looking for me, and I need to go to the place where they will most easily find me. So I think that's like the child is thinking of the parents' view of the child's view of the parents' view of the child's view, and I think that's the maximum intelligence that I can imagine. So it's a beautiful example of two people communicating without any communication, but simply through the anti-symmetry, realizing who's supposed to be looking for whom, they're able to come up with a joint strategy. And then that would be something in a society where you have lots of points of view. You don't just have the people you know, but you have to be able to imagine people you don't know and strangers and be able to negotiate a common ethic with that. So those are my thoughts based on what you said. Thank you.
Okay. Just a brief comment. I think we basically agree, and the ideas of the evolution of music and other kinds of synchronous behavioral patterns humans have a natural explanation in this tribal group level thing. And I also agree on the importance, at least, of the possibilities of humans to imagine the mutual salience of certain solutions to problems and adjust their behavior. In the lost child example that you were giving, but many people make the jump to the conclusion that this is a kind of capacity that somehow came with the growth of our brains. and then allowed us to develop this complex culture stuff. And I'm sort of putting that on his head. And I think you were thinking in the same direction of that these cultural practices of doing things together, even with people that you don't personally know, allowed for the emergence of this kind of individual thinking.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. I thought it was fascinating. And I want to build up a bit on the comment before. I'm in music cognition. And the thing that you said about that when people communicate together, they build up routines and coordination. Recently, there's been a lot of research in music cognition about joint improvisation, usually couples. And for example, if you ask two children in a music class to spontaneously play improvised music together, if the children are friends, or if they're like socially close, or maybe family, then the product of their music, if you record it and show it to an independent musician, is rated as better as when the children don't know each other or are not especially friendly. So, you know, I just thought it was like really interesting how the routines and the coordination also reflect in other domains than language. So it's
I wouldn't know of many. I mean, Tomasello has done in his recent, especially in his recent work, more on morality and normativity and the development and emergence of normativity in children than on language. So the stuff of language is already there in the older work, but come to think of it, I don't know. I don't think most of that of the experimental work that was done in his lab involved children that did not know each other prior to the experiments. So that there were created pairs simply for the purpose of the experiments to see under what conditions children start to impose norms on the other in the performance of the game, and how it should be conducted and so on. But so I don't know, at least it may be there. It's an interesting question of any research on differences between children in these kinds of patterns between children that already have some knowledge of each other, some personal history together, and those that are only members, so to speak, of the same culture, of the same cultural group. It would be an interesting.
Might be interesting.
Might be interesting to me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks. I'm Mohamed Ochika, linguist from here. Well, I'm to some extent sympathetic to that reasoning, correlating, let's say, communicative behavior and linguistic faculty or communication. But the real question for me is how far you can go with this idea when you really are linguists. So let's make a point. So when you look at your apprehension construction in Russian, and well, I'm sure about Czech data, I assume it worked for Russian as well. If you look at it, what's the necessary condition for that construction is subjunctive mood. And there is a cluster of properties which are related to that. For instance, all Slavic languages are strict negative concord languages, so you can have this, like, unlike in English, that negative indefinites plus negation on verb, and you have one logical negation. But this negative concord is lost when you use subjunctive with these apprehension constructions. So there is a cluster of linguistic properties. And my question is, how far you can relate this linguistic behavior to anything like a cooperation or stuff like that?
Okay, thank you. Good point. And it's a very appropriate question. Actually, it sort of formulates the whole reason for me to do linguistics. Is to explore the possibilities of connecting minute details of grammatical phenomena in a particular language to big questions about what makes us human. Why is this particle necessary in this construction to that sort of, and an important part of the answer is, of course, that there is not going to be a direct connection between the answers on one level and on the other. There's always going to be a pretty long story. So the proof has to be in the eating of the pudding, ultimately. Now, I do think that there is a way, there is a program at the very least for answering those questions, and it is the cultural evolutionary part of linguistics, grammaticalization theory. So the whole thing, I talked about the existence of conventions, but how conventions emerge out of initially non-conventional behavior, and how once a system of conventions is in place, it changes and interacts with non-conventional behavior, is something that is not in itself immediately, ultimately it is immediately driven by the most basic cooperative motivations for cooperative behaviors in humans. So it is important to distinguish and keep in mind the complexity of relationships between, in Tim Bergen's biological terms, are ultimate explanations and proximate explanations of these kinds of stories. And a complete explanations in cultural studies, including linguistics, as in other life sciences, biology in particular, have to include complete explanations, all of these four corners, and that's a responsibility of the field as a whole. The thing is, we should not neither fall into the trap of trying to explain the constraint of a particular particle being present in one position in a particular language directly from cooperative motivations of human behaviors, nor directly from assumed universal properties of human cognition.